afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to many of you. For those of you joining us for the first time, I'm Maggie Mahan, the Assistant Director for Advancement and Engagement with the State Historical Society of Missouri. Thanks so much for joining us today as the Associate Director of the Cape Girardeau Research Center, Bill Eddleman, presents the next installment in his genealogy series. Today's program is focused on getting the most from cemetery research. If you need to catch up on previous installments of Bill's genealogy series, today is the 15th episode, or if you would like to rewatch any of the segments, you can view them on demand on the State Historical Society of Missouri's website at shsmo.org. All events in our virtual programming series are made possible thanks to the generous support of the Society's members and donors. You can visit our website to learn more and see how you can add or renew your support. Welcome, Bill.
Thank you, Maggie. This is something that actually, if you look at the topics I've talked about, I actually became involved with cemetery research before any of the other record types. When I lived in Rhode Island, I got involved with the Rhode Island Historic Cemetery Transcription Project. And so I have actually co-authored a book on the historic cemeteries of Coventry, Rhode Island. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about, I learned and picked up at that time, and that's been quite a while ago now. There's two major types of cemetery data if you're going to research cemeteries. And most people think about the gravestone data right up front. This is what's on the actual marker, which that's what many people are interested in, and that's where many people stop. But also, for many cemeteries, there's cemetery records data. The only problem is, if you look at the number of cemeteries out there, these records have not survived or never existed for many cemeteries, particularly small family lots, farm cemeteries, and so forth. Even for some church cemeteries, the church records may have gone with the previous minister, or the church may have folded, and the records may have been lost. So you're really lucky if you do come across one of these situations where there was cemetery records. There's a number of reasons we're interested in cemetery information as a source for genealogical information. First of all, oftentimes the data on a stone are the only record that some individuals ever existed. That's particularly true with children. I've run across that time and again where you'll find a child's stone if you're researching a family, and then you start looking at the surviving children, and that child actually fits in a gap that you had between children. So if you have a gap that's, say, 4 years or more between children, it may be that there was a stillbirth or a child who died in infancy or as a young child. So here's a stone where there were actually 3 children that died under age 3. 2 of them actually just lived a few days. You can get clues to the religious affiliation of many individuals just by looking at the marker. This one is kind of a classic situation. You read the stone and it says, "In memory of William Brown, deceased 8th month, 1st, 1839. And that particular phraseology tells me automatically that William Brown was a Quaker. 8th month, 1st. In fact, early Quakers thought that markers were too ostentatious, so they have unmarked graves. So what else can we get from gravestones? Well, first of all, you can get a name, obviously. A lot of times you may get the real name rather than the nickname that appears in most records. You can get a birth date, either an actual birth date if it's listed, or a calculated birth date in situations where someone is listed as dying on a given date at the age of 83 years, 2 months, and 12 days. Then you can back calculate, and there's actually, you can Google calculators that will actually do that for you. You don't even have to think about it. and get the actual birth date. You can get a death date and oftentimes a place. That may also exist with the birth date. You can get age, either by calculating or it may actually be listed on the stone. You can get relationships oftentimes. Someone may be listed as the wife of John Smith. You can get marriage dates. This is particularly with the last few decades, many couples are listing marriage dates on their marker. Marriage place sometimes. Military service. If the individual has a military stone, obviously they served in the military. It may also just list their military service, even if it's not a government stone. Membership in fraternal or service organizations. Sometimes this is specifically mentioned. Most of the time, there'll be a symbol on the stone, on the marker, that is specific for that service organization or fraternal organization. For example, Masonic, the compass and other insignia that go with Masonic symbolism. Vocation or avocation, you got to be careful about that. I know a lot of times I've had people tell me that they think their ancestor was a timberman or worked in the timber industry because their marker is in the shape of a tree trunk. Well, that's not true. That's actually Modern Woodmen of the World. It's an insurance organization that oftentimes, depending on the policy, provides money for a marker, and you can choose different designs that all relate to a woodman or tree symbol. Economic status, I guess the ultimate in terms of low economic status is there's no marker whatsoever, and all the way up to huge monuments. Some various types of cemeteries. There are cemeteries that are affiliated with a church and actually attached to the church, right next to the church. There are other church cemeteries that are detached. That may be a situation where the church moved to another location, or in this case, this is a local Catholic cemetery where I live, and there are actually two parishes in town, and they just bury in one cemetery. There are commercial cemeteries that many people are familiar with. These may be government owned. In the case of this cemetery you're seeing here, Lormer Cemetery, is owned by the city of Cape Girardeau, or it may be privately owned. There are many companies that oftentimes have mortuary service and also a burial site. And then the one that probably drives people the most insane are the farm or family cemeteries. These are usually small, or they may be larger, and a lot of times out in the middle of nowhere because the farm was abandoned, grew up later, and now it's forest rather than an open area. Believe it or not, these people are standing in the middle of a family plot on an old farm cemetery. You can just see one marker in front of the gentleman there. One of the things you have to get over if you use cemeteries for research is a lot of misconceptions that people have about cemeteries. First of all, most people come into this and they think, well, my ancestor has a tombstone, because nowadays almost everybody has a marker. Well, I'd venture to say if you get back to about 1850, you're probably only dealing with 25 to 35% of people having a marker, and that was to start with. The markers may have fallen over and been buried. It's rarer and rarer the earlier you get as to whether your ancestor has a surviving tombstone. All cemeteries have written records. That is a real misconception that I run into constantly. Well, there must be records of this. Well, if people were burying family members on a farm, they're not going to keep a record of it. They might have a family Bible at one time, which has been lost decades ago. Or if they have a family Bible, it may not say where the family members are buried. But actually, if you take the total number of cemeteries out there, relatively few have written records. Someone is responsible for caring for all cemeteries, and that is absolutely not true. I know in Missouri, a lot of times people will go to the county and say, well, why aren't you taking care of this cemetery? And if somebody tells me that, my first response is, how much would you like your taxes to be increased in order to account for caring for all the cemeteries that are publicly owned out there? Typically, abandoned cemeteries fall under the jurisdiction of the county, but in actuality, that's just mainly to ensure that they're not destroyed, and then really nobody monitors that. So for the most part, nobody's responsible for taking care of cemeteries. If you are concerned about it, you have to take that on yourself if it's a family cemetery. Gravestones are primary sources. The stone that you've been looking at here for this slide is a good example of how that's not a primary source. Gravestones were placed by the survivors. The people that actually experienced the dates, the birth and the death may not be there anymore. So they're not primary sources. In the case of this marker you see here, these are one of my ancestral couples, Jacob and Elizabeth Rhine, and you see married Elizabeth Wills. That has been hammered to death wrong that she was Elizabeth Wills. She was Elizabeth Gladfelter or Clodfelter, and that has been abundantly documented with primary source documents. Yet at the time this stone was put up, family tradition was she was Elizabeth Wills. She was not. But here it is set in stone, unfortunately. Some other misconceptions about cemeteries. First of all, when you used to buy a headstone, it came as a set. There was a headstone that had all the information that was provided to the stone cutter. And then there was a footstone that went with that headstone, and all it had on it was the person's initials. So a lot of people, when they go to cemeteries, don't know that, and they find these footstones with initials and think they found additional burials. You have not. And it doesn't help matters any that people at most cemeteries hate footstones. So a lot of times they'll pull them up and pile them up in one corner of the cemetery or on one of the boundaries of the cemetery. And people find those and think it's markers for more individuals, and it's not. Another misconception is all cemeteries have been cataloged and inventoried. I would venture to say within 5 miles of where I'm sitting right now, if I did a little research, I could probably find a cemetery and visit it, and it has not been cataloged and inventoried because I have found them before within 5 miles of where I'm sitting right now. Okay, so the first step when you're researching a cemetery is you want to know where your ancestors buried. Where is the cemetery? Or what cemetery are they in? Well, first of all, you can try to find an obituary. And again, just like markers, obituaries are rarer the earlier you go. Not everyone had an obituary until probably sometime in the middle of the 1900s, probably. The earlier you go, the less likely there's an obituary. And then it may not mention where they're buried. It may have all this flowery language about what a wonderful human being they were and when the service is going to be, but not where the burial was. The death certificate, and again in Missouri, after 1910, there usually is a death certificate. In many states, it's after that. It will list usually the cemetery. However, what you run into is alternative names for the same cemetery, and you have to sort that out. Church records may list where the person was buried. Death records, if they're public death records, a death register, they may list the burial site, they may not. The family Bible may or may not. Family members. I know with one of my ancestors, when I got first interested when I was a teenager in family history, I asked about an immigrant ancestor, and she said, well, he's buried out in this cemetery near the Mississippi River because he wanted to be buried there because that's the first place he set foot in Missouri. And sure enough, you go out there today and that's where he's buried, away from all but his oldest son. All the rest of the family are buried elsewhere. And that was from my aunt. You can find cemetery data in transcriptions. The only problem is humans made the transcriptions. There's an error rate of probably about 5% in things like dates, anything connected with numbers. And so you have to verify it. Also, the ideal way to list burials in a cemetery is in burial order. And what do people do when they transcribe cemeteries? They alphabetize all the names, which destroys that burial order. Church records. You can find cemetery data if the church kept a register, or if the city kept a register, or the cemetery company kept a register. Government records like deaths. Genealogical libraries. Many genealogical societies in the early days of their founding, one of the first things they undertook was to transcribe cemeteries. And a lot of times these are only available in that society's library, which is why I'm constantly bemoaning the fact that genealogical societies are folding at a really accelerating rate, because everybody thinks all the information's online, so why do I need a society? Societies serve a good function, and this is one of them. Private individuals, you may have an individual that kept the records or ended up with the records. And of course, you can actually visit the cemetery to find the data. In fact, you're going to want to do that to verify the data. So how do I find the cemetery? It's not as easy as you think. First of all, in many locations, particularly where the cemetery has gotten into public ownership, they will be on plat maps. These are produced for most counties in the US now. They're really expensive compared with the amount of content you get because they are done by private companies, and it's really a lot of effort to assemble the information. Particularly, people keep selling property over time, and so it has to be updated. Topographic maps, many of which are now available for free online. At one time, the mappers kept information and locations for cemeteries and marked them on the maps. This is kind of something that's falling by the wayside, though. The Geographic Names Information System search engine, again, that's only as good as the topographic maps. Local residents, start asking, you know about where it is, start asking people around that area if they know where the cemetery is. Sometimes local histories will give a location. A lot of times it's not a very good location, not a very precise location. Local officials, and I would put under local officials people that work for funeral homes, because many older cemeteries occasionally do have a burial in them. And if anybody knows where to find these things, it's the people at the funeral homes who have to find where to bury them. Local officials may be a county assessor's office, maybe a mapping office or a surveyor, local surveyor. Church officials may have that information. Funeral directors, as I mentioned, and local historical or genealogical societies may have that information. And then also inventories and transcriptions. Well, here's what the sort of thing you would find on many old plat maps. The arrow points to a located cemetery, and because the owner of the property is listed as county farm, that is probably a county farm cemetery, sometimes also called pauper cemeteries, with very few marked graves, or if the graves are marked, they may be marked by a number or were originally marked by us, just a wooden cross. What you have to be aware of is that many directions that are published are not very good, and geography changes over time. This is a cemetery that actually was adjoining my grandfather's property when I was a kid. And in the 1930s, a Presbyterian minister inventoried a lot of local cemeteries, and he had horrible directions for most of them. So he said, just north of edge of city on Egypt Mills Road near Juden School. Well, okay. It's actually in the city now, and it's there is no such thing anymore as Egypt Mills Road. It's Highway 177, and Juden School is between a quarter and a half a mile from the cemetery. In the 1980s, the local society said north of Cape Girardeau, Missouri on Egypt Mills Road, Devers Farm. Well, we're getting closer. The Devers Farm was adjacent to it. And unfortunately, the fence fell down and cattle roamed through it and knocked over a lot of the stones. But it's still, you have to know which Devers to find it. By 2002, the Daughters of the American Revolution created a statewide book of cemeteries, which is of variable quality for the different counties. Cape Girardeau's was pretty good. So it says from Cape Girardeau, go out Big Bend Road to 2168 Big Bend Road, located on right side of road about 580 feet southeast of the barn, across a field. And, well, I can't read it because it's buried by the bottom stuff. In 2006, 4 years later, 700 feet south of Highway 177 at the point where Juden Creek crosses Highway 177. And this is my directions. Walk uphill around east side of pond, adjacent to Devers Farm subdivision. They sold, my mom and her siblings sold the place, and it's now Devers Farm subdivision. They built a pond in the middle of it, and that's the current directions. Well, you can see how they changed over time. They got better. It's about 3/8 of a mile from Juden School, across a creek, a state highway, and a county road. Landowners have changed twice in that length of time. The field is now mostly a pond and a new subdivision, and the barn is torn down. So, finding cemeteries, again, Geographic Names Information System. I hope that link is in your handout. If it's not, you can Google Geographic Names Information System. Plat maps, again, deed records. Oftentimes, in order to protect the cemetery from sale or development, landowners would deed it to the public, which means effectively the county. And so you'll find some of these in deed records with a description of the boundaries. And then a lot of times, if all else fails, just call a local library and they may know who to contact. The main thing to remember is no one source has all cemeteries in a given county or other area. We have, I think, around 220 that are inventoried in Cape Girardeau County. I'd venture to say there probably in actuality are well over 300 cemeteries that exist or have existed in the county. So you still can't find it. Is it destroyed? I have all sorts of horror stories of destroyed cemeteries. I'm often have said that people that do that should deserve to burn in Hades, but oh well. People destroyed cemeteries for various reasons. They're just ignorant of them. They went through with a bulldozer because they didn't know it was there. They constructed a road over the top of them. They built a building over the top of them. They pulled up the stones because they were in the way and they wanted to farm the area and have a continuous field. That happens a lot too. Are none of the burials marked? It's really tough to find these if there's no marked burials. You might find sunken spots where the burials were. Ground penetrating radar can find burials, but you have to know roughly where to look. So if they're not marked, it's really going to be tough to find them. Find out where your ancestor had land and who the current owners are and ask if they know. This may involve asking a number of people if the land was divided up. You can put a query with the local genealogical society or local newspaper, which I see less and less these days. It may just not be possible to find it. People tend to be obsessed with finding ancestors' burial spots. And at some point, for some ancestors, you're just going to have to accept that they're not findable. Okay, let's say you're lucky and you found it and there's marked burials. What do you do now? Well, you assemble tools. And if you look at these tools, some of them look a little strange for going to a cemetery, especially that shovel. First of all, I'd take data forms or paper. More and more, I would take my phone to take photographs, although I still take paper. A pencil. It's better than a pen. If you're out and it's 25 degrees, that pen's not going to work very well. A camera or a phone. A natural or soft bristle brush. Water. You can take distilled water. It's just as long as it's clean water, it's not going to cause that much damage. Distilled water is probably absolutely the best, but not necessary. A trowel or small shovel. Oftentimes, if a stone was knocked down, it's going to be buried as deep as 10, 12 inches deep, depending on how long ago it hit the ground. A probe to find down stones. I have a probe I made out of an axe handle, some epoxy resin, and a spike. A hand or full-length mirror or flashlight. I'll tell you what that's for later. Proper clothing. Right now we're entering the probably not the best idea to go to a cemetery season because in my case, poison ivy, many people are scared to death of snakes. I could care less. As long as I see the snake first, I'm fine. But many people freak out when they see a snake. And that's a good place to find them is in cemeteries. Insect repellent, obviously. And there's probably something under that I can't see. Ways to take home cemetery data. First of all, the best probably is transcription and proofread it to make sure you copied things correctly. It's the least damaging. It's subject to error, but proofread it. Photography is great. The only problem is if I go out in the middle of the day and the sun is shining directly on a stone, I can't get a good photograph. You can't read as well. You need shadow over the face of the stone at an angle to read the best. You can do a gravestone rubbing if the stone is in good shape, or an aluminum foil casting, again, if it's in good shape. Here's a detailed cemetery data sheet that shows a lot of the information that this would be ideal to collect in case anybody wants to find this cemetery again. And in case somebody comes back years later, they can realize that, oh, the number of inscribed stones on there was 15 in 2000 or 2023, and now I only see 6. Something's amiss. They're downed or something. Then just a general description of the site. Then this is for individual stones, and the abbreviations stand for different things related to the actual stone itself, what type of stone it is, what kind of condition it is, what shape it is, what state it's in, whether it's up or down or leaning or whatever, what kind of carving and legibility, and the height and width. So just copying things off the stone. People oftentimes really are obsessed with cleaning the gravestone too. The first thing I'm going to say about that, when all else fails, don't clean it. Because oftentimes cleaning a stone causes more damage than leaving it alone. However, should first assess the stone's condition and type. If it's a granite stone and it needs cleaning, you're probably not going to hurt it that much. If it's a sandstone marker and it needs cleaning, don't. Sandstone is very fragile. It's well known for spalling when you try to rub across it, which means everything just falls off and there's no inscription anymore. Okay, if it's okay to try to do something with, to try to clean it, try plain water and the natural soft bristle brush to rub across it very carefully. Oftentimes the problem is lichen, that crusty stuff or leafy crusty stuff that grows on stone. You can wet lichen and it's going to get soft unless it's the crusty type. And you can use a popsicle stick or a craft stick, little wooden stick, if the brush doesn't take it off, to try to remove it. And again, very small strokes, very carefully. The ideal thing to clean stones with is a material called D2. It was developed for cleaning monuments, and it actually, it's inert to stone, but it kills lichen and algae, which cause a lot of the problems for stone legibility and stone deterioration. It's expensive. You can buy it off Amazon. You can buy it from several dealers, several other locations. Just Google it. And you can also dilute it about, I'd say, 1/3 D2 to 2/3 water, and it'll still work. There are also some non-ionic detergents, Vulpex, Orvis, or PhotoFlow that will work. Not as good as D2 because they don't kill the problem, which is the lichen and algae. Never, and people always seem to want to do this, if it's limestone, this is deadly to the stone. They want to use acid or strong alkaline like oven cleaner. Don't do that. Use something that's neutral or inert. Otherwise, it will probably harm the stone. Never seal gravestones. People want to seal them too. Well, it'll prevent further damage. Actually, it won't. What it does is it traps materials inside the seal, which can accelerate deterioration. Freezing and thawing accelerate things with a sealed stone. And I've actually had people that say, well, we cleaned the stones in our church cemetery. Boy, they look great. They're nice and gleaming white, and we sandblasted them. And my response to that is, if you're going to destroy a stone, use a hammer. It's a lot faster, because sandblasting will destroy stones over time, and they'll be pretty much illegible pretty quickly because you've sandblasted away the surface layer. You've also not killed the problem, which is, again, algae and lichen. Many people want to do all sorts of things to read gravestones that make it easier to read the carving. A lot of these are not a good idea. One of the ones that used to be recommended a lot in genealogical publications is shaving cream. It's kind of like putting honey on the stone. It's sticky stuff. It doesn't come off very readily, and it actually accelerates stone deterioration. What they would do is spray the shaving cream on the stone, rub a credit card or something like that across it, and it deposits the shaving cream in the lettering. Wow, okay, I can photograph it now. Well, another 10 years, nobody will be able to photograph it because it will start deteriorating with all that sticky gunk on the stone. So don't do it. Many people want to use wire bristle brushes or strong chemicals. Don't do it. Colored chalk is oftentimes used. Colored chalk is a different material than the stone, and it's not a good idea to deposit a different material in crevices in the stone, because the elements act on that material in a different way than on the stone, and so you tend to widen cracks, get in holes in the stone or small pits, and enlarge them. Many people just, well, obviously I'm a descendant and I know what's best, so I'm going to remove the stone from the cemetery. Well, it wasn't meant to be removed from the cemetery unless the bulldozers are waiting until you're done. But the next person that comes and wants to find the information won't be able to find it because you've taken it away. There is an aid. I mentioned bringing a strong flashlight or a mirror, and I've used a full-length mirror. I've rigged it up with a prop so I can do this by myself. But here's what you do. If the stone is in the shade, you can move out to where the sun is, use a full-length mirror, catch the sunlight, and start directing it across the face of the stone until the lettering becomes evident. There are a few cautions here. Don't do this if you're pointing the mirror toward a road because you don't want to blind drivers. Also, if you're in a situation where you can't stabilize the mirror, if you're by yourself, you'll break the mirror. So be careful about that. Here's the example stone that before the light was directed across it with a full-length mirror. I can't read that very well. I can see McKay and November and May and 44 and 1925, but not much else. So I've directed the sunlight across it with the mirror. Voila, William L. McKay, November 5th, 1844, May 16th, 1925, at rest. And you can do this with a hand mirror. The only thing is, if you're deep in the shade, it's not as readily, you can't do it as readily. You might have to catch a little patch of sunlight, and you're not going to get a good photograph. You're just going to be able to read a little bit at a time. If the stone is in the sun, you need somebody else to help. That person stands and projects shade onto the stone, and then you get off to the side and and direct the light across the stone, and you can read it. There are a few other alternatives, particularly if you're by yourself and you don't have the mirror. Plain water and a soft brush. If you brush across the stone carefully, what it does, there's always dirt on the stone, soil, pieces of lichen and so forth. You can very carefully direct that across the face of the stone, and it will deposit in the lettering, and it makes it easier to read. You can also put a bag over the stone, like a black plastic bag or a paper bag, and use a flashlight. Get yourself under the bag with the flashlight, and you can read it that way. People will think you're weird if they see you, but it works. You can also just use a strong flashlight, particularly if you're in the shade, to read the stones. There are also some alternatives other than a glass mirror. You can use aluminum foil covered cardboard. The only problem is it doesn't catch a perfect plane of light to direct across a stone. You can also use mylar attached to a board, which isn't going to break and catches the light better than aluminum foil. You can use a 12-inch tube and just look at one letter at a time through that, and it helps to focus your eye on the lettering. And then later I'll talk about gravestone rubbing and aluminum foil casts. A few cautions about reading numbers. They were carved in specific ways, and they weather in specific ways. In this case, 1s and 4s are going to look alike with weathering. The only thing you have to go on is spacing. 1s were placed close together compared to 1s followed by 4s. Here is an example. This person died January 3rd or June. I think it's January 3rd, 1841. Notice the spacing. There's a big gap between the 8 and the 4. There's not a very big gap between the 4 and the 1. So it's 1841. It's not 1844. It's not 1811. 7s and 8s are going to weather. The 7 will be one line horizontal and then a line toward the bottom at a slight angle. 8s are going to weather away so that there's just a diagonal top left to lower right gouge. It's probably one of the hardest ones to puzzle out. With 2s, 3s, and 5s, you're going to have to look at the dots that were carved. With 2s, you got a dot in the upper left. With 3s, you've got a dot upper left, lower left, and then 2 crescents. With 5s, you just have a dot in the lower left, and then that sweeping piece up at the top that's not quite horizontal, and a crescent at the bottom. The 2s have a crescent at the top, and then the not quite horizontal piece at the bottom. And then 6, 9s, and 0s can look alike. You have to look at the vertical pieces and where they're distributed. First of all, let's look at 0s. There's going to be 2 identical vertical pieces, kind of half circles. The 6 will have a complete one on the left and a partial one on the right. The 9 will have a partial one on the upper left and a complete one on the right. A few other transcribing considerations. First of all, this is what drives me nuts. I'll talk later about find a grave. This drives me insane about find a grave. You should only record what's on the stone. Otherwise, you should cite a source for the other information. So that's why you only record data that's on the stone. So somebody doesn't go out later thinking, oh, there's a relationship on that stone. They go out and they get disappointed because they've gone to all the effort to find it and it's not there. If you put any other information in a transcription, you should place it in brackets, which indicates it came from another source, or in a comments field if you're using software. You can use Excel or other spreadsheet to record transcriptions, by the way. Record transcriptions in natural order, that is burial order, not alphabetically, because you're losing information if you alphabetize. It's just like I talked about with tax lists. Record data regarding the marker also. In other words, sandstone marker, pointed top, good legibility, moderate condition, hand or finger pointing upward carving, that sort of thing. For smaller cemeteries, you should construct a burial plot map, even if it's a rough sketch. So here's an example. And this is one I just created in Microsoft Word. It's not perfect to scale, but it shows the burial order. It shows that there's a separate enclosure for 3 of the people. It shows that there are unmarked burials. It assigns a number to each burial, which then keys to the transcription. And then you should always complete the transcription. Send it to a genealogical publication, whether it's a society newsletter or a state society journal or someplace else, because you're going to share it with other people that way. If your society, local society has a website, that'd be a good place for it as well. And here's a good format to follow: a description of the location and how to get there, a description of the cemetery itself, more information, where to go for more information that would elucidate the people in the cemetery. In this case, I include some census information, and then the actual transcription and a map of the burials. Again, if you're going to incorporate other data, label it and provide the source. So, gravestone rubbing. You should only do this if the gravestone is in good shape. If it's crumbling, forget it. Don't do it. You should photograph it. You can use butcher paper or rolls of craft paper or some similar paper that you can get at a craft store, and you use some sort of tape that's not horribly sticky to anchor the paper, and then use a charcoal marker or crayon to rub over. And don't rub hard, just rub enough to elucidate the carving. You're going to find a lot of symbols on gravestones, and sometimes they can tell you information about your ancestor and sometimes not. There's two types of these symbols. One reflects the era, the way people viewed death at that time. Others reflect the individual, which of course is going to be valuable for your genealogy. The one that's here in the screen is a skull with crossbones or wings. And that is not pirates. I've had people say that, well, my ancestor must have been a pirate. There was a skull and crossbones on their stone. No, in the early 1700s, these were used to represent mortal remains. Here lie the mortal remains of. And they're just something that reflected the way people viewed death in that era. This is I love these old slate stones too. They hold up under weathering very well and look pretty sharp, I think. By the mid 1700s, you started to see these winged angels, which are soul effigies. And sometimes they had wigs because people wore powdered wigs in the mid 1700s. Other times not. The scrolling on the side is just primarily decorative. By the late 1700s and early 1800s, the view of death was people were more focused on the death of the flesh, mourning the dead, earthly sorrow, and the symbols for those were willow trees, weeping willows, and urns. And so you start to see willows and urns, or both, on many of the stones during that era. Post 1850, it's kind of like the sky's the limit, all sorts of things. Some of them have specific symbols. For example, the one on the left with a flower with a broken stem or a bent stem, almost always when I've seen those, it's someone who died at a relatively young age, and it's kind of representing in the flower of youth being plucked by death. And then also you started to see symbols like the finger pointing up. Fortunately, I've never seen one of those where there's a finger pointing down. That's a good thing, I guess, but to represent heaven. When you see a lamb, that's usually on a child's stone or a young person's stone. You start to see gone home, and not only the finger pointing up, but also crowns, shaking hands to indicate a connection between the living and the dead. These were all 1800s themes. Doves, oftentimes carrying an olive branch, which was kind of a generalized theme to place on stones. And then toward the late 1800s and into the 1900s, the technology was developed to make porcelain photo insets on stones. And this is still done today, I believe. And the porcelain lasts. The only thing is, people also view that as a nice place to shoot 22 shells. I've seen a lot of these shot out, unfortunately. I've also seen situations where this is the only known image of the person. Somehow the photo they used didn't survive, and that's it. And then people also started to put symbols that represented the individual on the stone. And in this case, this individual was, this is a Masonic symbol. This person was in the Masons. This is a neat stone too. It tells where they were born, Halifax County, Virginia, and they died in Laclede County, Missouri. A lot of people misinterpret some of the language on the stones. So there were terms that were used in an archaic sense differently than we think of them today. I've had people who ask me about this particular one in memory of Catherine, consort of Jane or Isaac Reed. And they think, oh, consort, they weren't married. No, actually, consort in this day referred to the second or third or beyond wife of someone. They had been widowed and then married a second wife. So rather than the wife of, this is his consort. It's nothing dirty. And then if the widow, or if the wife survived as a widow, outlived her husband, she was a relict. And I've seen this term also applied to men upon occasion, but relict of, I think that's R.L. Stubblefield. An open Bible is another symbol you see on stones, which is on this one. Different materials were used for grave markers depending on economic status and also on the era. So early on, the very earliest markers were wood and so haven't survived, or else you'll see them referred to as field stones or rood stones. The earliest surviving ones are from the mid-1600s, which is pretty darn early. It was not very easy to carve stone. Only certain types of stone carved relatively easily and were accessible to people early on. So ease of access and ease of carving. So this is probably took a lot of effort on the part of the carver. This is actually a granite piece in memory of Wilson Fish, who died January 4th, 1832, in the 39th or perhaps 89th year of age. So this is just a regular old rood stone that they actually squared off and carved. One of the first stones to be widely available by commercial stone cutters was slate and sometimes schist. Slate is pretty easy to carve, yet very durable, and it occurred in deposits in New England, particularly. And these stones have survived incredibly well for the most part. So if you go to New England or anywhere on the East Coast, you might check out some of the old cemeteries to see some of these. Sandstone, easier to carve, doesn't survive well. I've actually been back to this stone in recent years and it's started to spall. The face is starting to come loose, but this was readily available. In fact, there were quarries for this sandstone like right down the bluff. For much of the 1800s and early 1900s, limestone, oftentimes referred to as marble, was the stone of choice. And actually it became so fashionable that it kind of replaced slate, which is unfortunate because it doesn't weather as well. So here's a couple of examples. There's different grades of it. Some of it is much more susceptible to lichen growth than others. And sometimes it was polished, which kind of protects it a bit from lichen. And then today we almost exclusively use granite, which is going to last a long time. It's very hard to carve, but with modern equipment, it's easy to carve. And then you also see bronze gravestones, particularly military stones. Many people, if they can't afford it, would cast concrete and write in it with their finger or a stick. And I've seen that quite a bit in poorer sections of cemeteries where the poorer people buried. And then sometimes other cast metals like zinc. A bit about online cemetery information sources. First of all, Find a Grave. Find a Grave. You may come out of this thinking, God, he hates Find a Grave. I use Find a Grave almost every day because the database is so large. You can, and it's very searchable. You can search by surname. You can search by location. You can restrict dates down. You can look for relationships. Um, it's very, very handy. I have some issues with it, but they're not, I'm just aware of the issues and take some of the information with a grain of salt. So in this case, I'm going to run through an individual whose name was Minerva Crow, who died in Crawford County, Missouri. You can also search for cemeteries. Oftentimes there's real precise GPS information, oftentimes not. So I'm going to look for Minerva Crow. You can narrow down a date range for when they were born or died. And so I searched for her in Crawford County, and I get this one hit. Her maiden name was Kimberlin. And I inventoried this cemetery, so I know that was on the stone. That's all I'll put on there is what was on the stone. And it's the Crow Farm Cemetery, which is about 2.5 miles past a locked gate in Crawford County. And I photographed all the stones in the cemetery. And actually, I think I didn't put Kimberlin. Somebody else got in later. That's one of my problems with Find a Grave. Somebody got in later and entered data that's not on the stone, which is against my personal standards. But the dates were on the stone. It gives each memorial a unique ID so you can cite the source. And I'm going to give you an example of where you can't trust what's in Find a Grave. This is my great-great-great-grandfather Fulbright. And he had an older stone, and a distant cousin, they were afraid the stone would become illegible. And they did it the right way. They had a new granite flat stone made, and they actually put it in front of the old stone so it didn't interfere with the old stone. The old stone is still in place. So if you look at this information, well, it looks pretty complete. The only problem is not all that information is on the stone. The only thing that's on the stone is what's underlined. Jacob Fulbright, not J. I don't know where they got the J from. I've never found a middle name for him. Junior is not on there. That's an assumption, which may or may not be true. The birth date and the death date. Nothing on the stone says where he was born, and it's wrong in any event. He was not born in Haywood County, North Carolina in 1778. That was Cherokee country, and you would have been killed if you were out in Haywood County, North Carolina area, if you were a white settler. In fact, they had just burned a bunch of towns 2 years earlier, the Cherokee, and so the Cherokee were not very happy at that time. And then death is an assumption because his land was in Oak Ridge, although we can't say that for sure. It's not on the stone. And then that stuff about him being the son of Jacob and Barbara E. Visor Fulbright, I don't have evidence directly of that. I have indirect evidence that he was Jacob Fulbright's son, and I don't have any evidence for Jacob Sr.'s wife's name at all. That came from an earlier genealogy, which has a lot of unproven things in it. He was the husband of Barbara Plump Fulbright. I got enough indirect evidence that that's probably true, but it's not on the stone. And this stuff about him being the father of all these children, probably true, but it's not on the stone. And actually, we don't have any document that documents directly his children. So there you go. All of this is not indicated by the stone. It's stuff other people have put in there that they think was right. People accept this as gospel. It is not. It is testable hypotheses for relationships. So the issue with Find a Grave is people can't resist being helpful. Some contributors think it's a competition. They're actually people that want to be the person in a given locality to enter the most stones of anybody else with no view toward accuracy. In fact, my father had not been dead 2 weeks and somebody entered his stuff and find a grave. They're now, relatives they have a moratorium for a given length of time now, and relatives can enter the information if they choose to. It is difficult, if not impossible, to correct stuff if it's wrong. So it's kind of like a lot of online things. You can't correct it. Here's a great example. William Joseph Drum, who's the progenitor of the Drum family in Cape Girardeau County. We don't know for sure that he was born in 1774 in Switzerland, first of all, but it lists him in Fulbright Cemetery. He's not there. He has his own cemetery some miles away that whoever did this didn't know about. And they put him here because his wife is buried here. So again, there's problems. On the other hand, billion graves, and one other thing about Find a Grave. It was developed by an individual who was interested in the burial sites of celebrities. So that was its reason for beginning. And it's been kind of co-opted for genealogy, which again, I use it every day. You just got to be aware there's problems. Billion graves was developed specifically for genealogy and has a much smaller database, but a much more accurate database with much more detail. So in this case, here's another Fulbright who's buried in a Lutheran church cemetery, Trinity Church, nearby in Cape Girardeau County, Missouri. But it's got all sorts of information that actually is the case. It's not stuff that somebody pulled in and stuck in there. So if we compare the two, the reason for development, Find a Grave by a guy who liked to visit celebrity grave sites, billion graves to meet the needs of genealogists. Locations of cemeteries vary in quality for Find a Grave. If it's in billion graves, it has a GPS location. Images for not all markers in Find a Grave, for all markers that that exist in billion graves. Number of records, again, here's the big difference. Probably in excess of 200 million in Find a Grave now, in excess of 40 million in billion graves, so quite a bit less. The mission of Find a Grave is to post memorials, remembrances, etc. And for billion graves is to provide accurate gravestone data. So it's for genealogy, but again, much smaller database. The other source of information, I've talked the whole time so far about the stones. There's cemetery records, sexton records. These are the people that are in charge of the cemetery. And these vary in format and quality. Most often they are going to be deposited with a government entity or a company if it's a private cemetery that operate large public or private cemeteries. Funeral homes are great if the funeral home is still in business. Try a local historical or genealogical society if not. Church records may be, or for a cemetery may exist for church cemeteries or congregation members buried in public or farm cemeteries. And they're often really hard to locate. If the certain denominations like Catholic, they probably survive, but oftentimes there are access issues with the information. Other denominations like Baptists, pretty rare event to have church records surviving. If you're really lucky, there's a plat map. What this shows is actually who bought the plots in the cemetery. And a lot of times there's blanks, which either indicates they haven't been purchased or they were purchased so early that they didn't record it correctly or it didn't survive. So if you find one of these, it's great. If you want to research the history of cemeteries, unfortunately, many of them are the sole remaining historical item relating to their history. So there's one I know about that I actually have an ancestor buried in. It was a Baptist church cemetery for which the records have not survived. Most people that even live next to it are unaware it was ever a Baptist church site. So it became known by the family that owned the property around it and that buried in it, the Wilsons. And many of them are African American. So it started out as a white Baptist church, and African Americans continued to bury because their slave ancestors had been buried in there. And then it also picked up a name of a nearby locality. It was an African American settlement after the Civil War called Concord. Well, that all buries the Baptist church history of this cemetery, unfortunately. You can obtain history from some other sources, many of the same sources that I've talked about before. Deeds are another source of information, if there was a deed for the cemetery. Yeah, I'm just going to go through a few examples of some stones that are of interest, and then we're done. First of all, this one is oftentimes cited as a source of information by Link genealogists. I'm a descendant of John Link and Margaret Fulbright. Unfortunately, this was placed in the 1930s. John Link died in 1826, not 1816. I've got his probate. We're not exactly really sure that it was Margaret Fulbright, although we're pretty sure. And there's also a family legend that got established at that the 1930s family reunion where this stone was set, which is unfortunate. Here's one where this is the grave marker for the grave digger. The graves around for many a year were dug by him who slumbers here, till worn with age he dropped his spade, and in this dust his body is laid. And also his wife, who was his widow, the relict. So here's the one that I used for example of 4s and 1s before. Very tough to read. Oftentimes you'll get details on military service, particularly Civil War. Here's an individual, it lists his regiment and company, and he was killed at Cold Harbor at the age of 20, and another probably brother who was killed at Sailors Creek, Virginia, again, relatively young, and then apparently their sister as well. Although you can't say that without more information. Oftentimes, stones of Irish immigrants particularly will list where they came from. In this case, County Wexford for John Costello, for Alice Costello, sorry. This was erected by her husband in her memory. This one is tough to read, but it gives the whole story of the young man's death. He was drowned in the Savannah River sometime in November 1816. His body was found and here interred by the citizens of Savannah, whose mention will ever be remembered with gratitude by his parents, and the rest was cut off. So his parents put this up later. Here's one where Free Chains is a labor organization, I believe Workmen of the World. Oh, this is a good one. I found this in Rhode Island when I lived there, and it said this woman should have been the wife of Mr. Simeon Palmer. And at first I thought when I read that part, oh, she died young before they could marry. But then you notice she was 64th year, she was 63 years old. And I did a little reading. Apparently Mr. Simeon Palmer was such a jerk, she moved out relatively early in their marriage, but still continued to provide him food and cook for him and take the food over to his house daily, but never really lived together as man and wife. So she should have been his wife, but he was such a jerk, she didn't want to live with him. Interesting story. And then this one. Died from stabs inflicted with a knife in her 44th year. The mother of 9 children who all lived to deplore the loss of so excellent a mother. Oh, 'tis a trying thing to be bereft of life by the vile hand of him who called her wife. And the cruel demon that drove him hence came from the curse of intemperance, which is a very flowery way to say he got drunk and stabbed her to death, and apparently had a problem with drink. And one of the other guys I was working with on this cemetery inventory looked up the newspaper of the time, and apparently he stabbed her and she got to the neighbors and was, basically going to die, and managed to stumble into the neighbors, and it was kind of a horrible thing. And but it's flowery poetry on her gravestone. So remember, in doing cemetery research, stop by here, friends, as you pass by. As you are now, so once was I. As I am now, so you must be. Prepare for death and follow me, which is an old and very commonly used New England epitaph. Good luck with your cemetery research, and I'll entertain a few questions.
For our first question, when a tombstone and a death certificate conflict on the dates, does the death certificate trump? Is it the authority?
I'd say not necessarily, but usually, because a lot of times you got to remember the death certificate was done at the time of death by the doctor. The doctor may have made a mistake writing down the date, but the tombstone, on the other hand, the information had to come from a family member to the stone cutter, who then carved it. And so you have a lot of more opportunity to lose information. And I've seen them off by a year before. And what I did in that case was I checked the probate file, and it turned out the tombstone was wrong.
Nancy asked, what is the difference between a cemetery and a graveyard?
They're synonyms for the same thing. Usually a cemetery is, a modern term used for larger graveyards, but they're really synonymous.
Megan asked, is there a resource to determine some of the headstone trends that you were talking about earlier? If you were trying to determine if a stone was placed at the time of death or if it was placed at a later date?
You'd probably have to generate your own. I know I used to do this with some data I had when I taught an ecology class and looking at survivorship data pre-1900 versus post-1900, and infant mortality was higher then. But you probably have to generate that yourself with known deaths. And I'm just kind of basing it on my general impressions with people I know about. I have one ancestor that had a marked stone in 1798, and I know I had a lot more ancestors pre-1800, so it's pretty rare that you get earlier. The DAR book is in 2 volumes. I don't have the title on the tip of my tongue. It is probably in larger Missouri genealogical libraries, such as the Midwest Genealogy Center, and you might also ask a local DAR chapter if they know where copies are. They were placed in local libraries where there were DAR chapters. And they range anywhere from some counties where it's just a list of cemeteries to detailed directions.
Paul commented that in North Carolina that there are statutes that if a cemetery or grave have been moved that require that process be recorded in the county's register of deeds. Can you speak to if there's something similar in Missouri?
If there is, I'm not aware of it. There is a cemetery protection law, which among other things states that you can't be denied access to a cemetery to visit it for the purposes for which one normally visits a cemetery during regular hours and so forth. So if somebody denies you access, theoretically, you can go to the county sheriff and ask about that and get access.
And you talked about D2 as a resource for cleaning. Okay.
Yep. Typically, the way that works is you put the D2 on the stone and let it sit for 30 minutes or so, and then wash it off with water. You can also lightly scrub. If you want to protect a cemetery in Missouri, cemeteries are protected from development in Missouri, but the interpretation of the law is if the owner of the property is not notified officially that the cemetery exists, which is kind of silly because obviously if you're looking out there and there's stones, there's a cemetery, but they can claim they didn't know it was there. So send a registered letter to the landowner informing them that the cemetery is there. White chalk is chemically the same as colored chalk. I'm seeing that question.
Okay,
so
perfect.
That means all chalk.
Okay.
No. Well, when I say burial order, somebody's asking, I would think that the position of graves are not necessarily in burial order. In time, burial order, yes. But what you're wanting to record is proximity, because oftentimes families tended to bury together. And so when you record them in the order of burial, you're recording potential family groups.
Rosalind asked, how would you know if the tombstone is sandstone, et cetera? Is there a way to best identify materials used?
If all else fails, if your local high school has an earth science instructor, they should be able to tell you what sort of stone, or you might be able to talk to someone at a funeral business. Mortuary business, and they could tell you what type.
Norman was curious, can you speak to, is there any type of a software that you would recommend to enhance a photo of a grave marker writing?
I would think, as with anything to enhance, you could probably use some of the software that's out there. I'm not going to mention any specific ones, but there are lots of photo editing software or image editing software. You might be able to enhance it that way.
Okay. There was also a follow-up query on whether someone should replace a stone if the stone has been completely eradicated and you have information recorded.
I'd say if there's a base still there, I would put the new stone in front of it. If there's no base whatsoever, I don't think there's any problem. What you may want to do, if it's not too much extra money for the carving, is put something on the stone that says placed in 2023, so that people know that's not an original stone. Okay.
Anne had a question about mail order tombstones and trends over the years. Is that something you can speak to?
Mail order tombstones?
Yeah. And so is there anything that talks about mail order tombstones and trends? They said, for example, like through the Sears catalog. Was that ever something that was done?
Not that I'm aware of. There is an organization called the Association of Gravestone Studies. You might contact them. I believe they have a website that you can Google, and they might be able to answer that. Is it common to find buried tombstones or markers? Almost every cemetery I think I've ever visited, if it's a family or farm cemetery, has some buried stones. So if your old cemetery is missing some, get out there with a probe and start probing to try to find stones.
So Bill, thank you so much as always for a great conversation about genealogy.